Hi, and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. We're so happy that you can be with us. Joining me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome. It's always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to be back.
Sir, we're going to be having an interesting discussion today. We're going to be doing some reviewing of the first year in office of this administration. On that note, they would have celebrated their first year, like I mentioned, on the 2nd of August. What is your assessment of this administration's first year?
To assess the performance of any government, any administration, I think one must use the human impact assessment if one is to be accurate, and I look at the last year to determine what impact it has had on the majority of the population, and in that regard I feel that the past year has been a very bad year for Guyana. In terms of the pandemic, COVID, I think that is the worst case, because we've had about 10 deaths per week, on average, for 52 weeks. We're well in over 540 deaths by now. Secondly, I would look at the dismissals of public servants, and again, we've had an average of 32 dismissals per week of public servants alone. I'm not talking about other enterprises. So again, the human impact is an accurate measure of the distress that has descended on this country. I would also look at the cost of living. Again, there are no official statistics, but anecdotal evidence suggests that the normal foods that people would use from the market, I'm not talking about the upper echelons of society who buy at supermarket, I'm talking about the people who go to the vendors in the market, would know that ground provisions and greens and fruit have skyrocketed over the last year, particularly because of the problems of delivery and production. And it was made worse by the flood, because there are at least 3 regions still have abnormal floodwaters on the land, and this is after 3 months. And because of the failure to plant new crops, the problem will worsen later in the year, because some of the farms which ought to have been planted over the last 3 months were underwater. So the food prices have gone up, and they will get worse later in the year. And speaking about floods, the damage that has been caused, even the president had announced that this is the worst catastrophe, the worst natural disaster in Guyana's history. It has not been calculated, and I expect that in a previous conversation with you, I had called for a commission of inquiry. We're not looking at blameworthiness, we're looking at determining the size of the problem, and right now we don't know. And there's a heightened level of insecurity as well. The rate of interpersonal violence, crimes, of street crimes, is very high. And the rate of unemployment also is very high. I don't want to say unemployed people are committing crimes, but there's obviously been a rise in both at the same time, unemployment, in terms of the loss of jobs. Nobody knows for sure, apart from the civil servants, nobody knows for sure how many other people have been losing jobs, playing dominoes at the wrong time, for example. And there is certainly a lot of insecurity, because I don't know if more crime is being reported, but as you know, the Guyana Police Force has created a new public information platform, and there is less reporting about interpersonal crimes, interpersonal violence than before. So all in all, After 1 year, it is normally maybe too early to say, to judge, but I think the evidence before us indicates that it has been a very bad year for the majority of ordinary Guyanese. And that would be my assessment. It's been a bad year for ordinary Guyanese.
Sir, they would have received some congratulations, though, from certain commercial enterprises and cultural and religious organizations. How justified are these compliments in light of the real situation? For example, the numerous things that you would have just mentioned.
Well, the question is, what is the real situation? The PPP lives in a different reality. They feel that by, handing out hampers and handouts, they're solving the problem. They're not solving the problem. Perhaps they're trying to provide relief, but there's no resolution to the problem that is before us. So we don't know what the real situation is because much of the reporting does not cover much of the hinterland, where the flooding has been, where the flooding has been very bad. The analyses have been only partial. They have been looking at inputs rather than outcomes. They have been able to tell quite accurately, I suppose, how many hampers have been handed out. But what has been the impact on families and on individuals and households? We have called for an inquiry in order to determine what damage has been done, what lives have been lost, how the flood and the pandemic and the dismissals have impacted on families. But this has not happened. And when we ask for clarity, the PPP just throw charity. This is what it did in 2005 at the Great Flood. Well, of course, Mr. Jaguar had his Great Flood, so Mr. Ali now has to have his Great Flood. So instead of getting clarity on causation, why these things continue to recur, we're just getting charity, and it's almost insultive that problems are not going to be solved this way, and we expected a chorus of congratulations, and I think the choristers have performed well, but the analysis has been lacking, and it has not given us the grounds for bringing about the changes which are necessary to slow the rate of deaths in the pandemic, to solve the problems of flooding in Guyana, and also to resolve the issues in the public service facing, the dismissals, to convene some type of investigation so that persons who have not been accused of any offenses, or have not underperformed, can be given a hearing. And these things have not happened. So I don't think that the congratulations are justified. There are a lot of very unhappy people in this country, not because of force majeure, not because of act of God, but because of the behavior of this government. And I think that the congratulations are misplaced. It's not a matter of the jury is still out. It is clear that the government has mismanaged the public administration situation over the last 12 months.
Sir, you mentioned three things just now that is leading into my other question, which is the pandemic, the catastrophic flood, and the uncaring dismissals of public servants. What is responsible for the mismanagement of these disasters?
The PPP has not been in government for 1 year. It's been in government for 31 years. No, we must get this right. Because the PPP comes with a lot of baggage. The PPP went into government since 1957, and it served for 7 years until 1964. We went into government again in 1992, and it served for 23 years. That's 30 years. We went into government in August last year, and served now from August 2020 to August 2021. That's 31 years. So the PPP is not a new kid on the block. the PPP is playing with an old playbook. What they're doing now, all these dismissals, they did before in 1992. What they are doing now with the flood, they did before in 2005. No inquiry, no explanation, and they just, throw some hampers at the people without actually solving the problem. That is why we continue to have these problems every time the PPP goes into office. Now, I would say that a big part of the problem is every president, every government has to allocate responsibilities. And it is my view that despite the 21 ministers, we don't seem to have someone who has their hands on the problem. And I am bound to make a comparison in my own administration. Ms. Babulal, what we call patient zero, died on the 11th of March 2020. And within 24 hours, the Prime Minister was, Mr. Nagamutu, was put in charge of COVID task force. And he did nothing else until the 2nd of August. And he managed that task force. And he was assisted by the CEO, Mr. Joseph Harmon. And we put together other public servants, including the President, Colonel Hussein, and they all worked together, but we knew who was in charge. Similarly, we had a whole of government approach. Every single ministry was involved in providing solutions and relief and responses to the pandemic. It is the worst pandemic we've had in the country. And every week they had to report on what they did in terms of education, what they did in terms of agriculture, what they did in terms of public infrastructure, what they did in terms of public health, what they did in terms of public security. Now, for example, the Ministry of Public Security, as we called it then, had to constitute mobile emergency engagement teams which went to the hinterland to stop infected migrants from coming into the country, to go into mining camps and logging camps and lock down those camps so that the infection won't reach the city. And I would like to think that the measures that we put in place were very effective. And when we left office after 5 months of the pandemic, we had 21 deaths. Now we have 10 deaths a week. So our whole of government approach and the fact that we appointed, I don't like to use the word, we appointed a czar, we appointed a person who had authority, that is the Prime Minister himself, who had nothing else to do but manage the pandemic. And of course we were supported by Minister Valda Lawrence, who's Minister of Public Health, but every other minister supported the Ministry of Public Health and the Prime Minister. So all I would like to say is that in terms of response to the pandemic, I would prefer to see a single person. I'm not looking at what the Prime Minister is called upon to do. I prefer to see a single person with authority in the cabinet reporting directly to the President himself, who is in control of everything. Not just the CDC here or the Ministry of Health there or the police there, but there's one agency which every single day examines, the situation about flights coming in, about locking down the airport, about, the hinterland. It's a total problem. Everywhere there are human beings, there are possibilities of the pandemic spreading. And you need a different level of management. And I think that is the problem, that the PPP simply has not put this authoritative mechanism in place. And I would think that it is a position that somebody with the rank and authority of the Prime Minister, somebody in that position should take control. The pandemic is not under control. as we can see, and there's been an apparent lack of confidence and trust in the government because of certain incidents which have taken place over the last year. So I would say that we need to, or the government needs to, re-examine the whole infrastructure and the superstructure for dealing with this pandemic, because now that we have new variants, now that we have in countries which felt a few weeks or months ago that it was handling the pandemic, now we've had resurgence even in East Asia, in India, China, other countries, Australia. People are very worried about what is happening, and the government seems to be quite cool. I think its self-confidence is misplaced, and it needs to restructure its task force. And I would say at the highest level, there'd be somebody of senior rank in charge of that task force. It's not the Minister of Health. It's not the Minister of Home Affairs. It has to be somebody with the clout of the Prime Minister.
The control and coordination of the weakest areas of public administration have faltered despite the presence of the 21 cabinet ministers. Why has that happened at this time with the present administration?
Well, there's an old saying, a dangerous disease requires a dangerous remedy. And we have to think outside of the box. We have to ensure that the response to this pandemic is much more robust than it is at present. The unfortunate thing is that the media, or some branches of the media, which are sympathetic to the People's Progressive Party, have a way of normalizing catastrophe. There is a bad flood, but nobody realizes that the flood has not ended. After 3 months, the newspapers have just shifted focus away from the flood, and things look normal. Things are not normal. A country that's been underwater in all 10 regions for 100 days, cannot be normal. But if you read the daily newspapers, you wouldn't know that some communities are still flooded. So the PPP has a method of softening the news rather than solving the problem. The problem remains unsolved, and the PPP is not going to have an inquiry into it, into the flood, into the pandemic, into the dismissals. That is not their style. Result is that we will not get solutions coming out of the government. So it falters. The PPP falters because it does not inquire into its own misconduct. It does not investigate, and as a result of that, it does not have answers. It goes on with this old playbook and it keeps making mistakes. And worse still, it does not accept not only criticism, it does not accept cooperation or offers of cooperation. These three catastrophes require whole of country response. It requires the willing participation of ordinary citizens. It requires the participation of the opposition. It requires the participation of all other parties. We need a whole of country response, and the PPP seems to be opposed to that. Sitting down with the opposition and learning from what the opposition did when the opposition, of course, was in the government. And it practices an attitude of exclusivity, and as a result, it excludes people who are really willing to help. People are forced to write letters to the editor because there's no formal mechanism for sharing ideas, and for the implementation of those ideas. PPP doesn't know everything. It thinks it does, but it's really making a lot of mistakes. And once we have things like the pandemic and the flood and dismissals of public servants and environmental damage, we need to create a platform in which civil society, well, the opposition, and other interested groups, professional groups, maybe even international community, the diaspora, could help to solve the problem that face us, that beset this country at present. This has not been happening, and the longer we have the PPP, the more mistakes there will be.
Sir, under your tenure as president, you were big on social cohesion and promoting unity. However, we saw the Coalition's Department of Social Cohesion dismantled, and also this administration would have promised to create a One Guyana Commission and Quarter of Unity. Why have they failed after 1 year to establish or fulfill these promises?
When you say fail, you mean you're suggesting that they tried. No, PPP hasn't tried to establish anything. They've talked about it. But, nothing is settled till it's settled right.
Okay.
And the ethnic question again, the race issue, however you choose to describe it, is a very serious problem in this country. And it inhibits citizens' willingness to cooperate with one another, community, people and government. It is a dampening factor. And as you can see what happened around the world with the notorious case of George Floyd last year, May 2020, it's unforgettable. Not because voices were not raised before, but because that was the straw, I suppose, that broke the camel's back, and the whole world was aflame. Not for George Floyd, but certainly the whole Black Lives Matter movement, called attention to the pernicious, the impact of racism. In my government, the Department of Social Cohesion had a focus on resolving as best it could the racial differences. Well, racial differences, are a matter of fact, but the antagonism that seems to arise from time to time, by looking at causation and also looking at solutions. We didn't expect the PPP to embrace the Department of Social Cohesion. They dismantled it. But by claiming to set up or promising to establish this One Guyana Commission, it sounds great, One Guyana Commission, but nothing has happened after a year. Again, you put the Prime Minister in charge. But, you need a dedicated department which looks at all of the attempts at ethnic cohesion over the past years, decades, and continues to work assiduously and continuously to resolve the issues of racial insecurity. I was very unhappy about the so-called Corridor of Unity, because the announcement was made in one part of the country, and I referred previously to the fact that on the 6th of March, the disunity that was displayed by the PPP with their 6 riots, stretched all the way from East Kanji to Tain to West Babis to East Demerara, East Bank Demerara. So if you're looking for a corridor of unity, you're looking at, almost a countrywide phenomenon. You're not looking at one little spot on East Demerara. Don't blame East Demerara for this unity in this country. We have to look at what is happening countrywide. And I don't think there's any serious attempt to create a department or to create a forum or an institution which could examine the race problem. That is as much as I want to say, but I don't believe that just making an announcement about One Guyana Commission and claiming that the Prime Minister is going to be in charge is the way to go about the issue. Race is too serious an issue in Guyana to treat it in such a manner. I'm not saying the Prime Minister is not a competent person, but the Prime Minister has other duties to perform. And I'm not seeing that that organization, that administration, that operational emphasis, coming out of the administration. I don't think the PPP is serious, or else they would have done more in the past year. They've done nothing really in the past year to operationalize that concept. Right now, there's no commission. I don't even know if the concept has been properly defined, but nothing's happening. The lights are on, but nobody's home, nobody's working to bring about an improvement in race relations in this country, as far as this administration is concerned.
Ms. Granger, in wrapping up, as president again, you would have launched a decade of development, which was started last year, 2020 to 2029. Has this administration shown any similar signs of strategic planning?
There's been a lot of ad hocery.
Okay.
As expected, they have not adopted or embraced my concept of a decade of development. That was a well thought out concept or framework. I admit it's only a framework, but we are putting too much faith in petroleum, and within the next 10 years, we will see that petroleum is a false god that we should not worship, and that we need to make plans, yes, to make maximum use of petroleum revenues, and at the same time, create a plan for the diversification of the economy, so we don't put all of our eggs in that basket. Now, my decade of development had a specific focus on education, especially tertiary education, which I said would be free to all Guyanese who are eligible for tertiary education. There was an emphasis on secondary education to ensure that all Guyanese children could get a secondary education. And this included creating A-grade secondary schools in the 4 new towns at Bartica, Mabaruma, Mahdia, and Lethem, so that children don't have to travel to the coast. We don't have to build more dormitories and more places for children from the hinterland to stay. People prefer to stay in their own regions. Parents have to be close to their children. It is not a good idea to move children away from their families, for an academic year, or even shorter periods. And it was my idea to take secondary education into the regions as well. So education was an important part of that plan. You also had to deal with youth employment. You had to deal with the question of equality. And anyone living in a hinterland region or a hinterland town cannot pretend that the quality of life, at Karasabay or Aishalton or any other hinterland location, or Mahdia or Mabaruma, is similar to what's taking place at or the quality of life in New Amsterdam or Linden. And we need to look at equality. People feel that the hinterland does not enjoy equal access to public services, although we've tried to do that in the coalition. So these are some, I can't go through the whole list now, but these are some of the elements of the decade of development. But the PPP said nothing. They're going on from week to week, but I keep thinking that there must be some type of unseen government, some type of deep state that is making decisions which seem to be so incongruous. Like this regional joint support team. I mean, people keep emphasizing it. We saw in the newspapers soldiers with guns. Those are not law enforcement officers. Those are there for border defense, and there is a lot of apprehension about these regional joint support teams or whatever they're called, because there are laws. The police force has a police act. It is the law enforcement agency. The Gang Defense Force is not a law enforcement agency. And there were problems before when the PPP administration in the first decade of this millennium tried to create these so-called joint teams between the army and police. It didn't work well. A lot of people died. A lot of policemen were killed. I think 22 policemen were killed by the bandits, and it was very badly managed response to crime. So what I would say is that unless there is better planning on the part of the PPP, the population will not be able to trust it. I mean, this is what is happening in the pandemic. People just don't trust what the government is saying. It's not a matter of the population being hesitant. The population doesn't know what to believe. We had an approach which was based on education, then engagement, then enforcement. Now the PPP is trying to jump to enforcement without grounding the population with education and explanation and engagement. So people are just being told now this thing is mandatory. It's not whether it should be mandatory or not, but the approach that the PPP has adopted has built or eroded trust in the government. So what we're looking for is a way forward. There must be a plan. The population must be involved. The opposition must be involved. Civil society must be involved. And the PPP must change its attitude. It's not a bullying attitude. It's a cooperative attitude. And the PPP has to learn to cooperate. It has to learn to collaborate. It has to learn to develop consensual relations with the rest of the population. It behaves as if it has, 101% of the population behind it. It only has 51%, according to the GCOM statistics. So we see a situation because of the lack of planning, the lack of involvement, people are suffering, poor people are suffering. And if the PPP doesn't change its style, its method of governance, more poor people will suffer in this country. Not only because of the pandemic and the dismissals and what is already taking place in the floods, but also the environment and every other field of administration. The PPP has had a very bad year, and life for ordinary poor people in this country has been very unhappy, very unpleasant.
Sir, thank you very much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you. And to your listeners, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we do like to encourage you, or continue to encourage you, to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.